Hi, we're going to discuss prenatal development, birth, and the newborn. In this video, we will discuss the prenatal timeline and teratogens. In the next video, we will discuss birth and the newborn. Let's start with the timelines. And I say timelines plural because there are two. And this can be really confusing because if you go online looking for information, websites often don't tell you which timeline they're using. And I've even noticed this problem in some textbooks. The prenatal timeline starts at conception, also known as fertilization, and it goes for 38 weeks. The prenatal timeline is divided into 3 sections of unequal lengths. We'll talk more about those on the next few slides. The pregnancy timeline begins with a person's last menstrual period and goes for 40 weeks. The pregnancy timeline is divided into 3 sections of equal lengths called trimesters. Now I said that the pregnancy timeline began with the person's last menstrual period, which means that they are not pregnant yet. They will ovulate and then fertilization will happen around week 2. So when somebody becomes pregnant, they are considered 2 weeks pregnant. And then they will probably find out that they're pregnant no earlier than week 4. Okay? So let's look at a time lapse of what's happening here. And this time lapse includes both animations as well as electron microscope photography. Okay, let's talk about the pregnancy structures. The fetus is housed within the uterus. It is fed by the placenta through the umbilical cord. And the pregnant body has to go through a lot of changes to make this happen because it's basically building a house. It has to build the placenta and the umbilical cord because non-pregnant bodies don't have those. It's also increasing its blood volume and going through a lot of hormonal changes. Now, not everybody experiences uncomfortable pregnancy symptoms, but of those who do, many report that they have the most nausea early on in pregnancy, and that's because of all these changes that are going on. Now, if you look at this fetus in the diagram, you can see that it's pretty close to being born. we can tell that because it's big, but also because it's upside down. Most fetuses turn upside down in the 3rd trimester because that makes it easier for them to be born. Okay, so the first stage of prenatal development is called the germinal stage, and at this time we call the organism a zygote, okay? And it starts with fertilization, also known as conception, and the single fertilized egg becomes a single-celled organism, and it divides and it divides and it divides again, and then it travels down the fallopian tube. Typically, fertilization happens in the fallopian tube. And then it implants into the uterus. At implantation, it is called the embryo. Often people don't even know that they're pregnant because a lot of times a fertilized egg never implants. It just passes right out of the body. Okay. The next stage is called the embryonic stage, and we call the organism an embryo. And you can see that I've given you both sets of numbers here. And here's some highlights. At about week 4 of prenatal development, the organism is about the size of a poppy seed, and it's teeny, 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 tiny. And the neural tube closes, and we'll talk more about that in the brain development video. And there's a tiny little flutter detected in an area that will later become a heart. So if you look at the image, what you see at week 4 of prenatal development, week 6 of pregnancy, is not a human-shaped organism yet, right? And this organism does not have a heart the way that we think of as hearts. So there's a tiny flutter that's detected, but the heart isn't fully formed, and it's definitely not fully functioning. So I mention this just because I sometimes see billboards or advertisements that say that the heart starts beating at 4 weeks. And I just want to make sure that you're clear that's a misleading statement. Okay, here's another highlight. Pregnancy week 10 is the end of the embryonic stage. It's also week 8 of the prenatal timeline. And the organism, the embryo, is the size of a bean, and organogenesis is complete. So organogenesis is the formation of the organs. Organo means organ, genesis means creation of. And so at this point, the organs are not fully formed, they're not functioning, but they're present in a very primitive way so that now, from this point onward, they can start growing and start functioning over time. Once organogenesis is complete, we move to the fetal stage, and we now call the organism a fetus. And here are a few highlights of that stage. So somewhere around pregnancy week 18, the fetus is about half a pound, and quickening happens. Quickening just means that somewhere in the late teens on the pregnancy timeline, the pregnant person is likely to notice the fetus moving around. Somewhere around pregnancy week 26 or so, the fetus is about 2 pounds, and the lungs start to make surfactant, which is necessary for later breathing. And so around this time is what we would call viability. Different sources place viability anywhere from 24 to 28 weeks. Viability refers to the point at which a fetus could be born and probably survive with medical intervention. Somewhere around pregnancy week 30, the fetus is about 3 pounds and experiences functional pain perception. So I give a little bit of a range from 24 to 30 because there are many steps involved. What the science suggests is that in order to feel pain, you have to have the receptors formed, and you have to have all the neurons in the whole pathway from the receptors to the spinal cord and to the cortex of the brain. All of those have to be formed, and the relevant area of the cortex has to be formed. And all of those have to be fully functioning. And that's just not physiologically possible until 24 weeks at the earliest. But that's not all, because there also has to be conscious awareness of the experience. If you remember from intro psych, we don't have sensory experiences in the body, we perceive sensory input in the brain. So researchers believe that the conscious awareness needed to perceive pain in a functional way happens in the third trimester, probably around week 29 to 30. So if you're interested, I've included a couple of sources in the optional resources folder. But I mention this because you may hear other ages that are given, sometimes going all the way back to the period of the embryo, which doesn't even make sense. But in some states, there are laws that are based on the idea that a fetus can feel pain around 20 weeks, but there's no scientific evidence for that, and that's a political issue, not a scientific issue. The next highlight would be birth. So somewhere around pregnancy week 40, the fetus is about 7.5 pounds on average, and we call this full term. Babies can be born as early as 37 weeks on the pregnancy timeline and still be considered full term, safe to be born, and they're no longer considered premature. Ultrasounds can be conducted anytime during the fetal stage, but they are very commonly conducted around 18 weeks or so because the fetus is large enough to be viewed clearly, but not so large that it's all crunched up and it's hard to see individual parts. Okay, so what are some influences on pregnancy? Well, there's some general influences like nutrition and stress and maternal age. Even paternal age seems to make a difference. And then there are environmental agents called teratogens. That includes infectious diseases, drugs and alcohol, all kinds of environmental agents like lead that you might encounter through lead paint, pesticides, pollution, things like that. And teratogens operate based on a few different principles. One of them is genotype. Some embryos and fetuses are simply more vulnerable to the effects of teratogens than others. So you may notice one pregnant person drinks a whole lot of alcohol and their baby is just fine, whereas somebody else may drink just a little bit and their baby does experience some effects. And so since you don't know your genes, it's always better to be as safe as possible when it comes to teratogens. Another principle is timing of exposure. So if you look at the chart here, you'll see that different parts of the growing body are more vulnerable at different points within the timeline. Okay? Also, there's the principle of specific effects, meaning that a single teratogen doesn't cause problems across the whole body. Rather, there are specific effects connected with specific teratogens. Another principle is dose. So more exposure to a teratogen is worse than less exposure. And then there's the timing of the effect, which means that some teratogens lead to effects that are visible at birth, but other teratogens may lead to effects that are not visible until later in development. The period of development when harm is most likely is the period of the embryo. Okay? So, in the next video, we will talk about birth and the newborn.